What if I told you that BRICS might just be planning to walk away from the United Nations altogether? And the real question is, would this mark the end of the UN as we know it? We've heard of countries threatening to leave before, but never a coalition this powerful, this influential, and this tired of the system. So why now, and what happens next? The BRICS nations, home to over 40% of the world's population, contributing around 31% of global GDP. And yet, when it comes to the real levers of power at the UN, they remain outsiders. The frustration is real. According to a report from Reuters in 2023, this bloc has grown tired of playing second fiddle while the Western powers dominate key decisions. But why are they thinking of leaving now? And what are the stakes? Here's a statement from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, speaking in 2023 at a BRICS summit, who claimed, "The current structure of the United Nations no longer reflects the geopolitical realities of today. The Security Council is frozen in time, perpetuating a world order where the West dictates the rules. BRICS cannot be expected to continue in an organization that refuses to evolve." What Lavrov, and indeed the entire BRICS bloc, is saying is simple. They're tired of being sidelined, tired of the veto power wielded by the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, where just one nation can block critical resolutions. BRICS wants influence that matches its economic clout, but after years of pushing for reform with little to show, they're questioning why they're even sticking around. Statistics from The Economist highlight that BRICS nations account for 31% of global GDP, yet none besides China holds a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. BRICS isn't the first to question the value of staying in the UN. Countries have threatened to walk before, but how serious were those threats, and what happened? In 1955, the New York Times published a piece titled, "France Threatens to Walk," as de Gaulle was frustrated with what he saw as an Anglo-American stranglehold. He demanded a greater role for France, much like what BRICS is demanding today. In 2018, Israel threatened to leave after years of what they deemed anti-Israel bias in UN resolutions. Yet, none of these countries ever actually left. But what's different now? Unlike past threats this time, we're talking about a coalition. A group of nations with significant economic weight, considering an exit. And that makes this crisis very different from any before. For the first time, it's not just one nation, but 5 of the world's most powerful emerging economies collectively challenging the status quo. If you are enjoying our content, please hit the like button. To help us even more, please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments. Your engagement helps us grow. Thank you. Speaking of leaving the UN, let's not forget the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. This bill was first introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1997 by Congressman Ron Paul. There are many iterations after that from different representatives, but none hasn't passed. But it's gaining momentum again. Why? Because for some U.S. politicians, the UN is a globalist institution that undermines American sovereignty. Sound familiar? Former President Donald Trump at the 2019 UN General Assembly, where he expressed skepticism about the UN's ability to serve US interests. According to Trump, the future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. Trump's rhetoric wasn't just about grandstanding. He was tapping into a belief held by many in Washington that the UN no longer serves America's interests. And this mirrors the frustrations felt by BRICS nations, who are tired of watching Western nations set the rules of the game while the rest of the world has to follow. The BRICS nations have been calling for sweeping reforms within the UN for decades. But what exactly are they asking for? BRICS, particularly India and Brazil, have been pushing for permanent seats on the Security Council. Why? Because they believe that an organization meant to represent the global community should reflect today's geopolitical realities, not those of 1945, and they're not alone in this belief. A quote from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2022 reads, It is high time that the UN's decision-making structures reflect the world we live in today. India, with over 1 billion people, should not be denied a permanent seat at the table. Statistics from the Brookings Institute show that India and Brazil, despite being two of the world's largest economies, still don't have permanent representation at the Security Council. This has been a point of contention for years. But it's not just BRICS. There are 54 countries in Africa, 54 sovereign nations with no permanent seat on the UN Security Council. None. Zero. So why is an entire continent with a population of 1.3 billion people left out of the most powerful decision-making body in the world? This exclusion has real consequences. Without representation, African nations struggle to influence decisions on global conflicts, climate policy, and economic sanctions that affect them directly. A recent piece from The Guardian in 2023 quoted South African President Cyril Ramaphosa as saying, "Africa cannot and will not be ignored forever. The imbalance of power within the UN must be corrected." Data from the African Union shows that Africa accounts for over 30% of the UN's peacekeeping forces, yet they have no say on when or where those forces are deployed. It's not just the Security Council. The Western powers also dominate global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. According to the Financial Times, the US alone holds 16.5% of the voting power in the IMF. Combine that with its allies, and Western countries control over 60% of the decision-making power. Meanwhile, BRICS nations, who account for nearly a third of global GDP, are left with minimal influence. According to expert economist Joseph Stiglitz, the Western nations essentially dictate the terms of loans, development programs, and economic policies. Emerging economies, particularly those in the BRICS bloc, are often left with little say, even though these policies impact them directly. So, how does this imbalance of power marginalize emerging economies? For years, BRICS nations have been vocal about how the policies imposed by the IMF and World Bank disproportionately benefit Western countries at the expense of developing economies. Brazil and India, for instance, have long argued that Western-controlled financial institutions often impose economic policies that stifle growth and increase inequality. In a 2021 World Bank meeting shows Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman called for an overhaul of voting power structures. Sitharaman claimed emerging economies need a larger voice. The current system is outdated and does not reflect the realities of today's global economy. According to a 2022 World Economic Forum report, the combined GDP of BRICS nations surpassed that of the G7. Yet, their voting power in institutions like the IMF remains disproportionately low. With all this inequality, why are Western powers preventing countries like India and Brazil from getting permanent seats on the Security Council? It comes down to one word: power. Western nations have little incentive to share their influence. By keeping India and Brazil out, they maintain their control over the most powerful body in the UN. For the US and its allies, expanding the Security Council is seen as a direct threat to their ability to control global decision-making. By keeping it small and exclusive, they can ensure that their interests are always prioritized. But does this exclusivity lead to biases? Many in the BRICS bloc, as well as other developing nations, argue that the UN's actions are often dictated by Western biases and double standards. But what do they mean by that? A prime example is the UN's handling of conflicts in Iraq and Libya. Many argue that Western nations use the UN to justify military interventions under the guise of human rights, while similar crises in non-Western countries were met with far less urgency. According to a Brazilian diplomat, Celso Amorim, the West picks and chooses when to intervene based on its own interests, not on any consistent standard of human rights. A recent report from the Harvard Law Review found that Western nations were responsible for over 75% of the vetoes used in the Security Council between 1990 and 2020, many of which blocked resolutions that would have held their allies accountable. The BRICS nations have been quietly waging an internal battle within the UN for more influence, but it's not just about getting a seat at the table. It's about reshaping the very structure of the UN to reflect the new world order. China and Russia already hold permanent seats. But for countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa, the fight for influence is ongoing, and they're not alone. Countries across Africa and Latin America are beginning to align themselves with the BRICS vision for a more balanced UN. A quote from The Economist in 2023 shows South African President Cyril Ramaphosa pushing for greater representation for African nations. According to Ramaphosa, we cannot continue to have a world order where the voices of the global South are marginalized. The UN must evolve or risk losing its legitimacy. Statistics from the Council on Foreign Relations show that BRICS nations have been steadily increasing their contributions to UN peacekeeping missions and humanitarian aid programs, using these as leverage to push for reform. The tension between BRICS and Western powers has already created geopolitical frictions that are playing out across the world. But how is this affecting global relations? China and Russia, in particular, have used their positions within the Security Council to block Western resolutions on issues ranging from Syria to Venezuela. And this is just the beginning. A report from Foreign Policy in 2022 highlights how China has used its veto power at the UN to protect its allies in Africa from Western sanctions, while Russia has consistently blocked resolutions that would hold its government accountable for actions in Ukraine. The Security Council has become a battleground for geopolitical power plays. China and Russia use their vetoes to protect their interests, while the US and its allies struggle to maintain influence. Recent data from the Global Conflict Tracker shows that the number of vetoes used at the UN has increased by 20% in the past 5 years, with most of them being wielded by China, Russia, and the US. So, how can the global order be reformed to reflect the new realities of power and influence? BRICS nations have been pushing for a more inclusive, multipolar world. But what does that look like? Experts have proposed a range of reforms to the global order, from expanding the Security Council to include permanent seats for India, Brazil, and African nations, to restructuring the IMF and World Bank to give BRICS countries more influence. According to economist Jeffrey Sachs, the world is no longer dominated by a handful of Western nations. If the global order is to survive, it must evolve to reflect the realities of today's multipolar world. Recent polls from the Pew Research Center show that 68% of respondents in BRICS nations believe the current global order is outdated and needs reform. Meanwhile, 54% of respondents in Western nations believe the UN should remain unchanged. The question is no longer if the global order will change, but how quickly. And if the BRICS nations follow through on their threats to leave the UN, that change may come sooner than anyone expects. We hope you are enjoying this video. We're thrilled to have you with us today. If our content struck a chord or sparked some inspiration, go ahead and smash that like button and hit subscribe to join our awesome community. Your support is super valuable and helps us grow. Stick around and check out another video from our channel, which is now on the screen.